My reflection will go in the following ways in 5 minutes. One, the debt challenge in Africa is not a new phenomenon. It has been and continues to be a challenge even after HIPIC. So I've just projected on that slide the trends in the gross government debt on this continent as a share of GDP. And you can see that it just continues to go up. We have already heard from the earlier speakers why this is happening, so I'm not going to go back to it, but I think we need to focus a lot more on how can we stem it? How do we stop it? Now, a lot of things that has been raised by the keynote speaker was a little bit of mention in my brief intervention. First, on the global financing architecture, whether we are reforming or dismantling or evolving to new ones, bears a lot of contemplation. And I just also want to raise the point that the architecture, liberalism, neoliberalism, and so on, has seen and served their purposes quite a lot. And there has been a lot of benefits. There's been a lot of winners and losers. And it's left for us as Africans to think about which end of the spectrum have we been and why. What have we been doing that we need to change so that we can start benefiting from a global economy that is here to stay, may not be dismantled so easily because of vested interests. So for me as Africans, we should also smartly think about how can we play the game so that we benefit from the existing game, even as we evolve into new ones? And when I look at other regional economies in Europe, in America, in Asia, China, and the rest of them, this is exactly what I'm seeing happening. And we're already hearing, even from the United States, the architects of this neoliberalism in the 1940s, and now neoliberalism, and also the Bretton Woods institutions, calls for reforms, including this whole issue about reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring in the global trade architecture, is all just sharing the views of what our eloquent keynote speaker have raised, that this current economic architecture needs some change, whether it's reform or total recalibration, and so on. My question is, where are we as Africans in that discussion? Are we having global discussion, Pan-African discussions in terms of how we have benefited in this architecture, how we can position ourselves to benefit better in the coming architecture? Because from what I have seen in economic history, there is no economic paradigm that is set in stone. It always evolves as society evolves and begins to change in order to create new systems that addresses contemporary problems. I note one thing in the speech of the keynote speaker, that a lot of authors that are being quoted, most of these authors, I think if only a few one, like you quoted in Kandawire and so on, we all rely on the thinking of global experts from the global north and increasingly Asia, with regard to how they see the world and how the world can serve their interests better. So no wonder then that because of that knowledge dependence, that evolves from economic dependence, we also are not actually shaping our own African narratives the way we should in order to be able to evolve new systems, how we participate in the global financing architecture. The point I'm making here is that neoliberalism has served this purpose very well, and it's really tired, as already we've heard from our keynote speaker, and it's currently evolving. We as Africans need to evolve as well, participate in that evolution, so that in the new global architecture, we can have our voices, our realities, and our own economic structures and systems, our cultures and other things, many great things from Africa that should inform how the world sees its economy and operates. So that is one thing, that call for us to engage proactively with our own realities. Second is about debt. There's been a lot about talk about debt and how it will make Africa not grow. But again, when I look at all the global economies, including what the keynote speaker also cited, no economy grows without debt. Whether it be a private sector firm or a country, debt financing is a very key way of actually accessing capital today in order to grow faster than you would have if you relied on your own resources. But the challenge is the quality of debt. What do we borrow for? How do we borrow? Why do we borrow? What do we use the resources for? In Africa, if we continue to borrow for consumption, we are doomed to continue to have debt defaults because consumption does not yield in order to be able to repay the debt. And when you borrow for investments that does not have the cash flow to be able to repay the debt, that debt is already bad debt. In my former world, in an investment firm, if I issued a loan that's a bad debt, my job is on the line. So that leads to one point that the keynote speaker raised in terms of transparency, not only on the side of the debtors, but also on the side of the creditors. Creditors that continue to lure countries to borrow when already we know that this is bad debt has some questions to answer. So, but for me, debt is an instrument of growth when used effectively. So the question for me is how we channel debt for growth in Africa, making debt work for growth and not making debt a liability on the continent. The third point he raised about African solutions being inside of Africa, no one can agree better than I do with that in that regard. But I also note from his speech and also from my own experiences, Africa is not lacking ideas or lacking policy instruments or lacking visions. We have the Agenda 2063, we have the high fives of the African Development Bank Group, we have the Lagos Plan of Action, we have the ACFTA, and we have several very well thought out policies, strategies, and development plans. And for the countries in Africa that I've worked with, a lot of them also have these well-crafted policies and action plans. But the problem is in implementation. How do we unblock that implementation challenge? And what I see are a number of things: weak institutions, weak regulatory frameworks, alien governance systems that does not really align with how the cultures and the political economies of countries function. And because of that, you have a group of leadership that is maybe already made incapable of delivering, because without institutions that define transaction costs, defines innovation systems, defines all the ways that you build markets and economies, institutions are the core of it because they define the rules of the game. So the lack of that institutional capacity is something that we really, really need to think about if we have to get out of this quagmire that has been very well painted for us. We need to try and address the external drivers of the debt that we've been talking about. Deterioration in terms of trade. Why is it happening in Africa all the time? Why is Africa not using what it has, natural capital, to be able to add value to that, improve domestic revenue mobilization, deepen our own financial and capital markets, so that the issues that have been raised with the use of monetary and fiscal policies, there's a lot that can be discussed on why Africa couldn't raise the massive fiscal easing that was done for COVID and in many other financial crises because of the size of our markets, our reserves, our capital markets, and the rest of them. So we need to look at this current architecture, in my view, and think about how we can make ourselves play the game better as we continue to work on addressing the reforms or the replacement or dismantling, whichever way that the global economy will evolve. That discussion is going on now. We need to continue to work together in order to make that happen as we go forward. Now, the other point is about the bleeding. If I talk about the theme of the conference, stopping the bleeding. Look, no one else will do it for Africa than Africans. If I just use that analogy, if I get hurt in my arm and it is bleeding, I don't need a medical doctor to tell me that I need to find a way of stopping my own blood from flowing out of my system. Because if I don't do that, I might die even before the medical doctor comes. So when I was a kid, you are told, tear your clothes and cover it, and so on. So for me, the financial outlays in Africa in terms of IFFs, illicit financial flows, we need to actively try to change that. Nobody else will do it for us, because if it is in their interest, they're not going to stop it from happening. Africans can do it, and Africans should do it.
Policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first.